Hello and welcome back to Pet Squares. It's been a while. I'm your host Adam Marsland, and we're about to delve into one of the most fascinating mysteries in rock and roll history, the story of the Beach Boys' unreleased, some would say masterpiece, SMiLE. Before we get into that, I just have a few bits of business here. I've had 3 go-rounds of doing the research for this show because this is a pretty crucial story and it's a lot to untangle and provide to you. And then I decided before I taped I needed another go-around of research just to get everything all in my brain. And I've decided I'm going to tape this immediately after that. So here we are in the wee hours of the morning, and that's part of the reason why you have this kind of strange yellow light around here. There's no natural light in the room. So I apologize for that. Maybe at some future date I will move the filming into another part of my apartment. The other thing I want to tell you is that as a musician, I've just released a new song. It's a cover of a song by a friend of mine called I Thought I Could Fly, and it's available already in video form on the same channel, and I will drop a link for it. Enough of the preamble. Let's talk about the most famous unreleased album in rock and roll history, the Beach Boys' SMiLE. Now, as most of you already know, SMiLE was intended to be the follow-up to the Beach Boys' groundbreaking 1966 album, Pet Sounds. And it was intended to come out in the first few months of 1967, although it was still being teased as an upcoming album as late as June of 1967. Spoiler alert, it never came out, or at least it never came out in its originally intended form. It became a legend that only grew in the intervening years as tracks from the sessions gradually leaked out. And to many, those tracks fulfilled the hype that Brian was working on the greatest album of all time. One that, if it had beat Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band to the marketplace, might have reshaped the direction of rock and established the artistic credentials of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys decades earlier than what happened in real life. Instead, the album's non-appearance marked a sudden and precipitous collapse in the band's fortunes in the U.S. at least, and a long period of exile in their home country as music trends shifted in 1967 to heavier psychedelia and hard rock. The album's shadow loomed over the band, especially for Brian, who exhausted himself making the album and whose confidence was shattered by the experience. In the 1980s, bootlegs began to appear, and the murky third and fourth generation tapes that were collected from all manner of sources by bootleggers on dubious vinyl albums we found in the back of certain record stores, I'm old enough to remember this, further fired the sense of mystery and imagination of musos. With Dominic Prioris, a music historian of some note, his extensive fanzine and then later book, The Dumb Angel Gazette, furthering the mystery and galvanizing music fans and musicians like Darian Sahanaja and Nick Walusko of the Wondermints, and around the same time in the same place, although we hadn't met yet, myself. And I'm talking about the late 80s here. The Beach Boys' artistic star continued to rise in 1990 with the release of Pet Sounds on CD, and then further in 1993 when the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations box set for the first time released some parts of the SMiLE sessions officially, which further fueled the clamor to hear the completed work, or as much as we could possibly get, in its entirety. And as fate would have it, the Wondermints and Darian Sahanaja in particular played a crucial role in the music on SMiLE finally being assembled as a completed work by Brian and his band, including Darian and Nick and Probin, in 2004, and it was a smash success. Critics raved over it. It hit number 13 in the charts in the US. Word has it that it would have climbed even higher in the charts, but the label, which I think was None Such that put it out, they didn't expect so many sales to happen, so they basically ran out of discs to sell. So it probably would have been a top 10 album had that not happened. The SMiLE has a completed work which was called Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE, and it, even though it was very well regarded and was mostly based on what was done by the Beach Boys in '66, did depart in significant ways from what was done back in the day, but still as faithful as was probably doable at the time. It garnered near universal acclaim, which validated Brian's original vision. And in 2011, the SMiLE sessions followed, which collected what existed of the album's original 50 hours of recordings, finally, quote, releasing the album to the extent that it could be released. Brian was markedly happier once the album came out and stated that a weight had been lifted from him. And just as an aside, I was in the audience for the Brian Wilson SMiLE DVD when they did it live. You can see him in a couple audience shots. Look for the bleach blonde hair, and I think I was wearing some weird cap. But anyway, I really noted at that show how relieved Brian seemed. I couldn't believe how upbeat he was. Like all the shots of him smiling that you see on the DVD for that. That was legit. That was real. I was there, and it was something for me as a fan to see a story of this album being rewritten. And told Darian at the time that he deserved a medal, and I still think so, for basically being the catalyst for rewriting this tragic story into one with a happy ending, but one that took nearly 40 years to occur. 40 years where people tried to unravel the mystery of what SMiLE was originally supposed to be and why it never came out. And so we're going to delve into that right now as we talk about the bulk of the sessions for the album, which took place in the last half of 1966. Before we get into the analysis of the rise of SMiLE, I want to acknowledge a lot of my research sources. I was inspired in terms of how I wanted to do this by the SMiLE visual timeline made by Reddit user Starmine202. Other things I looked at were quite a number of Endless Harmony and SMiLE message board threads, the blog If Music Could Talk, Cassandra Burke's Carbon Freeze blog, and most especially, particularly when I wanted to go back and get one more round of understanding this album, there's a great blog done in 2019 with an accompanying YouTube channel called Behind the SMiLE, and I was unable to locate the name of the guy that did that. Of course, I also reviewed most of the primary material, including the Beautiful Dreamer documentary made by David Leaf, whose book, Beach Boys and the California Myth, was one of the first to make the case for Brian's artistic timelessness. David Leaf has a new book out about SMiLE, and he did actually reach out to me to be interviewed for Pet Squares. I was a little confused by his email, and I wasn't quite sure what he wanted to do at that time. And also, I'm not really set up to do interviews here because I live on the other side of the world from all these people. So that was a very kind offer of his. David Leaf, bless his heart, certainly has a very particular take on what SMiLE was and what it represented. In doing this show, I like to try to be as journalistic and as neutral as possible at first and then form my own conclusions based on that. So I decided I wasn't going to be too influenced by any one person's perspective on SMiLE and try to just get as much of the facts as I could do. And I want to say that when I went into this, I had a fairly clear idea of what I wanted to say about this album and what I thought was the main reason for its non-appearance. And through doing this research, I've had my mind changed a little bit. When you approach an idea as objectively as you can and just let the facts tell you how to form your opinions, that's how I like to roll. And so, meaning no disrespect to David Leaf or Dominic Priori or any other person that's championed this album, and God bless all their contributions for helping get this album known and eventually a finished form of it appearing. I just wanted to sort of go back to the source material and get as many perspectives as I could, and that's what I did. I think it's useful to clarify things by focusing on the timeline, and we're going to go through this chronologically, and that way we can sort of sort out what happened and when with all these different tracks. And so we start out in May 1966, where Pet Sounds is released to mixed response, but in the United Kingdom, at least, it was greeted with rhapsodic reviews. And Brian is then consumed with trying to complete his next single, Good Vibrations, and we covered that saga in the previous episode of this series. So the next significant event is Brian entering a songwriting partnership, much as he had done instinctively on Pet Sounds with Tony Asher, with a guy named Van Dyke Parks. Now this happens in July. This was Brian and Van Dyke's second meeting. They had previously met casually at a recording session, and then they met again at a party being held by Terry Melcher, who is Beach Boy Bruce Johnston's erstwhile partner, and at that point very much at the center of the LA music scene, being the producer of the Byrds records and also working for Columbia Records. I'm not sure if he was still at Columbia at that time or not. I think he was. But Van Dyke Parks, likewise, was a very central figure in the LA music scene at that time. And it's lost a little bit in the shuffle because Van Dyke's role in SMiLE was primarily as a lyricist and also assisting with conceptualizing the album and making some arrangement suggestions as well to Brian and occasionally playing. But Van Dyke Park was a musician, arranger, and songwriter in his own right, and he had already done sessions for the Byrds and the Raiders and many other key LA acts. And interestingly, despite his artistry, because he was a very artsy guy, he also was, like Bruce Johnston, an industry guy. He was somebody that, even though he was kind of a hipster and kind of out doing his thing and mixing it up, he had a lot of friends on the other side of the console and inside record company offices and such. And so he appeared everywhere and in unexpected places, such as a panelist for a talk show and as an arranger for Disney movie soundtracks. And despite being a lyricist for the project primarily, he did bring a lot of arrangement ideas and organizational skill to the project. And I think it's fair to say this was the first time that Brian had collaborated with someone on or near his own musical level. I mean, Van Dyke Parks was a genius in his own, he's still with us as of the time of this filming in 2025, a genius in his own right. He was a multi-instrumentalist, he was an arranger, he was a songwriter, production experience, and he went on to do a lot of amazing things. So Van Dyke Parks was a heavy hitter, and Brian had never dealt with something like this before, but he was at a musical crossroads. He needed to take the next step from Pet Sounds, and he was existing at a time when music was clearly moving forward. Brian really wanted to take his music to the next level lyrically. Keep in mind, Bob Dylan was a very, very big influence on what was going on. He had recast the terms of what rock music could talk about. Tony Asher, I think, was a brilliant lyricist on Pet Sounds, but he was still very much within the relationship realm of songwriting. I mean, he was writing about it much more maturely than the Beach Boys had done in the past, but still, it wasn't groundbreaking topical matter. And Brian wanted to find a way in to this deeper lyrical plane while still expanding and developing his musical experimentation and growth. Just like with Tony Asher, Brian hires Van Dyke Parks on instinct. Van Dyke Parks, of all things he had been doing, wasn't really a lyricist. He was just a very erudite fellow, an East Coast intellectual, and impressed Brian as somebody that could, he had a great vocabulary and a lot of depth and abstraction of his ideas, and thought he would be a good lyricist. And as it turned out, in terms of what Brian wanted to be inspired by and what he wanted to make happen, Van Dyke Parks was a very good choice, but it was an instinctive choice. But they got right together, and very quickly the collaboration flowed beautifully. And the two of the first songs that they collaborated on were Heroes and Villains and Surf's Up, which is widely agreed to be one of Brian's very finest compositions. So not bad work right there. And that gave Brian the confidence to embark on his new direction. And another thing that gave him the confidence was the new hipper social circle that he was now surrounding himself with. Brian was now operating on a separate track socially and artistically from the rest of the band, who were constantly on the road over the summer. And as you recall, Brian had left the touring band to focus on recording and producing the records a year and a half prior. So the little time that the band did have at home during that summer of '66 and into the fall was spent on sessions to complete Good Vibrations. Brian, being like a sponge, as his wife has said, loved being around them, loved listening to them, loved absorbing ideas from them. Every new idea got him excited. And let's recall that Brian's background and the Wilson brothers' background is very lower middle class, not intellectual, very musical, but not intellectual. And with a hungry kind of mind like Brian's, being around all these sophisticated people who were going to talk about things that would never come up in Hawthorne or at the Wilson family dinner table, must have been, and indeed was, intoxicating for Brian. The new circle of friends that surrounded Brian really was pushing him to expand his creativity and get into these new areas that he wanted to explore anyway. But now he finally had a support system that said, yeah, Brian, go ahead and do all your weird stuff, stretch out. So in terms of the division that would emerge between this circle of people that were fueling Brian in various ways, within the band, Mike Love has emerged as the, quote, villain in the SMiLE saga and has indicated in his biography that Brian was, I'm paraphrasing him now, trying too hard to impress his hipster friends. Now, that's a take you would expect from Mike, who's a fairly meat and potatoes kind of guy, I think we can say. But like many things with Mike, his ground level viewpoint contains a kernel of truth. I mean, compared to Pet Sounds, which already had run into commercial trouble, the lyrics that wound up being used for SMiLE were extremely esoteric and would likely be very inaccessible to the band's teenage audience in 1966. And keep in mind, as we sort of look back on this album and regret that it didn't appear when it did, because it would have put the band much more on a level with what happened in the rest of the 60s. None of that stuff had happened yet, barring the Beatles excursions and what Dylan was doing. The really heavy-duty, weird psychedelia, that was just starting to happen. Brian was right on the cutting edge of that stuff. So at that time, the Beach Boys was still a very big band, but they were still mostly, they were selling records to teenagers who, you know, had yet to tune in, turn on, and drop out. That was the 60s vernacular. I wasn't around, so sorry about that. There's been much debate about whether Brian's new friends were healthy supporters or enabling hangers-on, and the balanced view seems to be it was a mix of both. One of the blogs I read, and I read a lot of them to prepare for this, had an interesting sort of rundown of that person's impressions of the different personalities that were around Brian at the time. The balanced view seems to be, as I said, it was a mix, and people such as industry figure David Anderle playing an active role in helping Brian achieve his goals, and another industry guy, Michael Vossi. They seem to be the biggest white hats in this whole scenario, and along with Van Dyke. And there are some others who have been accused of fueling Brian's demons, and they probably did. But anyway, Brian soaked up all these ideas and started conceptualizing this new album. But with so many interests and concepts floating around, it was a malleable thing. Anderle and others felt it was important to fuel Brian's creativity without putting any restraints on it. And for a time, Brian thrived that way. And he let Van Dyke Parks know that he was ready to do a project with no limits and was okay with pissing off the Beach Boys and pissing off their fan base. And Van Dyke has said, Brian was very clear on this. It was something they got clear from the outset, because, and I think it's an honorable thing if it's true for Van Dykes to have done, because Van Dyke really did push them in quite a radical direction. And it fell to Van Dyke to corral all these different ideas that were floating around. And Brian, being increasingly fragmented in terms of his attention span, would get caught up in this idea or that idea. Let's put this in the album, let's put that in the album. It was up to Van Dyke Parks to, I'm just going to call him Van Dyke, I'm tired of calling him Van Dyke Parks. It was up to Van Dyke to sort all this out and sort of figure out what was the cohesive overall structure of the album going to be. And it's significant that SMiLE is the first Beach Boys album that does not reflect Brian's own thoughts, but someone else's. I mean, Brian's thoughts are in there. You know, Brian was certainly captivated by many of the new metaphysical ideas advanced by the counterculture and filtered through his friends, so he might immediately launch on a song about astrology or health food or whatever. But this would cause issues later when trying to pull all the disparate ideas together into a cohesive whole, particularly when Van Dyke Parks started to become disenchanted with the situation and left the project a couple of different times, leaving Brian to kind of sort through a lot of concepts that he had contributed to, but he didn't have as much of an overall sense of how they fit together as Van Dyke apparently did, at least the lyrical concepts. Anyway, those concepts for SMiLE included spirituality. Brian famously called SMiLE a teenage symphony to God, reflected in its early and quickly discarded title, Dumb Angel. Humor, fitness, astrology, but the most overarching theme is that of Americana, which is certainly a contribution from Van Dyke Parks, with him retroactively calling it a journey from east to west and an American riposte to the British invasion. But again, that's Van Dyke Parks' concept, and the other more fleeting ones were the ones that came from Brian's imagination and increasingly fractured focus. And Van Dyke Parks had an interesting comment when he talks about how he wanted it to be an American album and something that was a response to the British invasion. That Brian and the Beach Boys were the last man standing after the British invasion with the onset of the hippie movement, about to change that. But at that time, America had sort of reeled from the British invasion. Its musical identity had been appropriated by the British and then sold back to us. And Van Dyke Parks seemed a little offended by that, and wanted to get something into this burgeoning marketplace that was uniquely American, something that could compete on the level of the British invasion, but that was American and not British. And that's the lens through which he saw his participation and the way he could use Brian's voice for his agenda. That sounds a little harsh, but Van Dyke looks at Brian and goes, what is the clay I've got here to use to mold the kind of thing Brian wants? Like, it actually kind of reminds me a little bit when I was in a band called the Standells for a while. They were a 60s band, and they had one hit and a lot of really cool deeper cuts they were one of the earliest garage bands. And for a while I was working on a comeback album for them before we parted ways. And when I was writing songs for that album, I was taking on someone else's voice. The Standells songs, most of them had this character, sort of like Charlie Chaplin had the Tramp, right? Where there was like this sort of downtrodden, misunderstood guy from the poor side of the tracks. That was the guy that was singing those songs. And I only bring that up because I think when Van Dyke's thinking about this Americana concept, there's all kinds of things he could have written about, right? But he's looking at Brian and the Beach Boys. They're like the last all-American band that were really still on top by '66, in his view. And I think that was the fulcrum, the inflection point he used to get this Americana idea going in his head. The tool he had for his lyrics were Brian and the Beach Boys. They were very American, so let's make a very American album. Now, musically, of course, that was Brian's domain mostly, although Van Dyke Parks did contribute quite a bit to the arrangements, if not the actual songwriting of the music. But there was another big change with SMiLE going from Pet Sounds. The sound became more stripped down. Pet Sounds was very lush, a very big sound. It had sort of a John Philip Sousa influence. We talked about this in the Pet Sounds episodes. And it was focused around very complex songwriting and large combinations of musicians with unorthodox combinations of instruments and unorthodox chord progressions being used, which created a very unique, somewhat dissonant, slightly odd, but beautiful sound. The SMiLE tracks, the song production on them is much sparser. There's a lot more sense of space, there's fewer instruments used. There were still highly complex compositions like Surf's Up. More often than not, the tracks were built around little riffs. Often it's just, a lot of the SMiLE tracks are just two chords moving back and forth. Yin and yang, shift back and forth seesaw, with a moving bass line providing the song's hook, giving it the uniqueness so it didn't sound like, well, just two chords, right? But one similarity to Pet Sounds is the reverb that was used interacting with the instruments created a lot of the sonic sound of the album, but whereas Pet Sounds was kind of gauzy and lush, SMiLE sounded a bit more spooky. One of the big sounds of the SMiLE album was just simply the harpsichord, which is sort of a Baroque and slightly creepy sounding instrument, interacting with the reverb. And a lot of the other parts of the songs were filled up with unusual percussion elements. And so the tracks just had, compared to Pet Sounds, kind of an eerie Baroque quality. I can remember talking to Alan Boyd, who's the Beach Boys archivist, about this in a private conversation, and although I don't think he'd mind me sharing it, and he found the SMiLE tapes quite disturbing because he thought it was basically a recording of the breakdown of Brian's psyche, and we'll get more into that in a minute. But these two chord progressions back and forth, and this sort of the kind of eerie, kind of dark quality that had crept into the songs and the production, you can make that argument. I mean, if you listen to it knowing how Brian spiraled, particularly during the latter part of the production of SMiLE, or non-production, that's a fair read of what's here. But the simplicity of the tracks also goes with Brian's concept of putting together a whole album in the same modular style as Good Vibrations, where he would try out different ideas in sections before stitching them into a whole song. It also postponed pulling all these ideas together, and it allowed Brian's creativity to run wild. If Brian had an idea, he didn't have to flesh it in a whole song. He'd just drop everything, do it. He'll figure out where it goes later. But just as that was problematic for Good Vibrations because it took 6-7 months to get done, this would make it 10 times more problematic to try and pull that all together in this stitching together method for a whole album. Now, we can't talk about SMiLE and talk about Brian's state of mental health interacting with SMiLE without discussing Brian's drug use. And it's something that has been blamed on the non-appearance of the album, particularly by his bandmates. I don't know much about drugs other than a little bit of THC. I've never really done any. But there's no question that Brian's behavior became more and more erratic, more paranoid, and his attention span and ability to concentrate did go down. And one wonders if the modular concept, like, okay, I'm just going to do this one thing, lay it down, and go on, wasn't a result of Brian's focus starting to deteriorate or a way to cover for it. It could be that Brian was increasingly unable to focus enough to get completed tracks done. Although, as we'll see, the evidence suggests that he did have a reasonably good idea about how this was all going to happen at first. But the sort of simplicity of the tracks, the back and forth kind of banging your head against the wall kind of quality of the chord progressions of a lot of them, and the repetitiveness of some of them, I don't know, but it does make me wonder if this newfound simplicity wasn't a way to keep the ball rolling without having to pull an entire song together in one session and just sort of figure it out later. Do what you can do now. It's hard to say. How much the collapse of Brian's psyche during SMiLE was a factor of drugs versus lack of outside support from the band is a hotly debated topic then and now, and it depends on who you talk to. And the opinions people have on this topic, particularly the topic of drugs, will align with the personal perspective of the person in that situation. For people in Brian's new circle, many of whom were in the drug culture, probably nearly all of them, drugs were a net wash or even a positive because Brian was doing a lot of speed, for example, and that enabled him to work longer hours, theoretically. For people in the family business who used less or not at all, the changes in Brian were alarming and easily attributable to drugs. What seems true is that although much has been made of Brian's use of LSD, it seems to have been Brian's abuse of amphetamines that contributed the most to Brian's declining mental health and stability in '66 going into '67. At the same time, though, it seems clear that Brian's organic mental health problems were beginning to seriously manifest at this time, as is often the case for men in their early 20s. So, as always, it's a chicken and egg situation, but it's clear that the mental illness and the self-medication and escape the drugs offered for Brian's mental illness issues, which must have been terrifying for him in his situation. They all fed off one another, and neither one did the other any good. But to sum it all up before we dive in, what makes the SMiLE sessions so intriguing is not just the mystery around them, but the mood the songs create, with a sparser sound dominated by the harpsichord and bass, and just sort of spooky creepiness of it all, versus Pet Sounds in-your-face sort of traditional band kind of, marching band almost kind of sound. The Beach Boys sound had evolved from garage rock to hard-driving rock and roll to lush jazz-influenced pop, and now it had turned dark and spooky. The mystery of SMiLE isn't just in what happened to the project, it's the mysterious sound of the music itself. So with that, let's dive in, and we'll start talking about the songs that were recorded in chronological order. Now, this isn't going to be musical analysis as I've done in the other episodes of this series, because we don't actually have an album to analyze, so we don't know how these songs would have appeared in finished form. I will be doing that as the songs appear one by one on successive albums, but I will be talking in overview terms about what each of these songs was like and where they fit into the puzzle of SMiLE. Though there was a track list submitted to Capitol in December, which gives some clue as to the state of the project at the time, and we're going to be referring to that quite a bit, what was and wasn't part of SMiLE shifted over time and is a subject of hot debate, and the easiest way to track the story is, as I said, start from the beginning of the project and follow the timeline. So the first session for SMiLE, barring Good Vibrations and one session for Heroes and Villains, which we'll talk about in a little bit, was for the song Wind Chimes, which took place on August 3rd, 1966. And the success of this session seems to have restored Brian's confidence, because if you'll recall, there was a period in the summer of '66 when Brian couldn't wrestle Good Vibrations to a conclusion, that Brian started to just took a break, and he started to kind of question whether he could finish it, and we will see this occur again in the following year. So Wind Chimes, I've talked about the fragmentary nature of a lot of the SMiLE tracks. Wind Chimes is a complete thought from a songwriting perspective, but it's also fairly short. Much of its runtime was taken up with a fade out in the original version, which again keys around just 2 chords, with a changing bass line providing the hook, it's an interesting link between the more complex songwriting of Pet Sounds and the 2-chord back and forth that characterizes much of SMiLE. The original version has a slight variation at the end with a more intricate bass hook, and an ascending section that seems designed to link into something else, which is how it was eventually used in Brian's version in 2004. But this song shows Brian moving in the direction of refinement and simplifying of the sound, filling the track with less. Now, there were 2 versions cut. The original version is mostly harpsichord and percussion interacting again with a reverb, with a backbeat coming in towards the end, whereas the later version is a bit more esoteric, being driven mostly by mallet percussion, marimbas. And then there's a kind of a big beat chorus, which is more suggestive of the band's earlier sound. There's a multi-overdub section of pianos repeating the main 2-chord theme, and I believe this was done later, if I recall correctly. This was Brian overdubbing a bunch of different pianos, kind of all keying off each other, but it goes on for quite a long time. But it's interesting because Wind Chimes is one of the few songs in SMiLE that supposedly was finished but for the final editing and mix by December '66. But the wordless chorus section does beg the question if there wasn't room for more to be added on the chorus. And one thing we're going to see again and again is a lot of these songs got all the way up to getting lead vocals cut, and then there were no lead vocals cut. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I think that is as we go along. But anyway, Wind Chimes, for sure a song that would have been on the final album, one of the more completed SMiLE tracks, and one which was redone in a radically different arrangement on the album that did eventually appear, Smiley Smile. The next session was a song that was variously called Look, untitled song number 1, or later dubbed Iran, which on the completed version of SMiLE was with new lyrics entitled Song for Children. It shares obvious connections to another SMiLE track, Child is the Father of the Man, and in the completed version of SMiLE, it was connected to it as part of a suite. Now, what's interesting about this song is Brian only returned to it once during the original sessions in October 1966, And there apparently were vocals recorded for this, but this is one of the sessions from the album that has been lost over time. So we don't know what was recorded that day. It seems to have been done concurrently, that's October session, with A Child is the Father of the Man, again indicating a connection between the two. And the release version that we hear on the SMiLE sessions has a little bit of vocal from Carl that was apparently flown in from the tag of Surf's Up that he did in 1971, which is again, Child, Father of the Man. So somewhere at some point, this link was made official. But from what I can tell, that little vocal bit wasn't there in '66, unless it was done as part of the lost session. We just don't know. When they were pulling together the 2004 version of SMiLE, and of course, Darian being in the room, Darian wanted to get as much of the lost vision of SMiLE in the finished product as he could, because that's the kind of guy Darian is, and I love him for it. So when they bumped Look up against Child and Father of the Man, Brian got very excited and said, that's it, that's the way it's got to go. And this was such a reaction that Darian asked Van Dyke Parks if this was the way it was back in '66, and Van Dyke Parks simply said it was inevitable, which tells us nothing. But that's as good an answer as any. The lyrics for Song for Children were newly written by Van Dyke Parks in 2004, so it's unclear what was going on with it in October 1966, or if this was even going to be on the album, because it was not returned to after October. The main hook melody was used at the end of Good Vibrations, which was being finished up right around this time. So it could be argued that Brian didn't intend to use it at all. It's really hard to say. It's not on the final track list that was submitted in December, so it may have been abandoned by then, or it might have been intended to be part of Child is Father of the Man, which was on the list. Musically, there's a carnival atmosphere, again anchored by harpsichord with driving bass and counterpunctual horns, and it's another completed songwriting thought, but it's basically built around two simple parts. Whether this would have been on the album or not, nobody knows. The lost session might have cleared it up for us, or maybe it wouldn't have. Now, there also seems to be a connection between Look/Iran/Untitled Song Number 1 and another of the most famous SMiLE tracks, which is Wonderful, which was the next song recorded, and in the beginning it was faster than the version that we're familiar with, but it was slowed down a whole step. And again, this is a completed songwriting thought, and structurally it has more of the complexity of the Pet Sounds tracks, but again, much sparser. Wonderful is Mike Love's favorite SMiLE track, and it is indeed a gorgeous melody. Though it seems to have been mostly finished by December, Brian was seemingly unhappy with it and attempted to remake it in early part of 1967 in a very spooky kind of bizarre style with some weird vocal effects added at the end that I'd never heard before researching this, and also through the bulk of the song adding an odd low rock with me Henley. Rock with me Henley. Brian predicts the Eagles. Rock with me Henry chant, which seems to refer to an Etta James song. It's just, what is it? What's that about? Because the song Wonderful, although Van Dyke Parks' lyrics are open to interpretation, they seem to be about the awakening of sexuality in a young woman. And again, this goes back, doesn't it, to the song we just did, which seems to be connected with Child as the Father of the Man, and we're gonna see this idea of childhood, which Brian had toyed with in Pet Sounds. It comes up again a few more times with SMiLE. There's Brian sort of thinking about childhood or possibly regressing a bit, because Brian seems to be less concerned about the transition to adulthood, which he was talking about on Beach Boys Today and Beach Boys Pet Sounds, and now some of the concepts he's contributing seem to be about regression to childhood. So regardless, this is a song about seemingly adolescence, and it's got sort of a childlike melody to it. But getting back to Brian's tinkering with the song, I mean, most people that have heard the original version of Wonderful, which had a lead vocal significantly by Brian, finished by December 1966, which is a little bit of a rarity for SMiLE, having lead vocal finished. Most people think that version, which again features harpsichord, is the definitive version. And yet Brian is messing with it a month later in very strange ways, in a much more bizarre version. And then there's even a third version track the following April, when Brian had mostly stopped work on these tracks, which just had piano and some backing vocals from the group. And when it finally comes out on the SMiLE album, it gets really weird with a part in the middle that just sort of, I don't want to overhype the song, but it's almost like putting a mustache on the Mona Lisa. It feels like Brian wanted to ruin this song in some weird way. I can't explain it, but I'm going to quote the Behind the SMiLE blog, because I love what he said here. He says, "Wonderful is an example of Brian nailing down the perfect SMiLE arrangement, only to second guess himself and fall down the rabbit hole of re-recording, trying to fix what was never broken in the first place, only to resolve in a complete opposite arrangement for the eventual SMiLE album." Yes, that, exactly. So Wonderful was basically finished by December 66, except Brian undid it, which is, we're going to get into why he might have done that, but in this particular case, it's kind of inexplicable. He had a great song and he just wasn't happy with it. Anyway, this is 3 for 3 in the harpsichord trilogy, with more, as I said, the childlike vibe carrying through to the track. And again, it leads more towards the Pet Sounds complexity sonically, but it's still stripped down in terms of the production, with the key counterpoint elements to the harpsichord being a Hawaiian style guitar and a horn, I think it's a trumpet, which oddly, he never redid the track, but there's an audible squeak on the I guess it's the trumpet. And that could be, for all I know, why Brian couldn't deal with the original Wonderful. Maybe it's because he never did a retake of the horns. But you can hear when the horn comes in, it's like, it's really an obvious mistake. Maybe that's why Brian kept redoing it, that one horn thing. Hard to say. It seems like he could have done something, I don't know. Anyway, at this point, Brian restarts Good Vibrations. He gets his light bulb moment on September 1st, and which I discussed on the previous episode. And on the same day that Brian does the pivotal September 1st session, he also tracks a song called He Gives Speeches, although actually its proper title is actually Persuasion. And this amusing track was a one-off and does not seem to have been considered for SMiLE, but interestingly, it comes back as the basis for She's Going Bald on SMiLE. So Brian did not forget this track, even though it seems like he did, because he never came back to it again. But interestingly, this is a harder driving track with a heavy backbeat and a pounding piano, bassline hook, and it presages a little bit Brian's later work in the 70s around the Beach Boys' Love You time. And even though it doesn't seem to have been intended for the album, it does fit in with Van Dyke Park's Americana concept. In fact, as I think about it, this is the first Americana song that is tracked. The previous three were all, had different themes. So this might have been a warm-up for that idea, or something Brian thought he might have wanted to incorporate later. The lyrics seem to describe Mark Twain, who, interestingly, this is a bit of history, but Mark Twain used to give anti-imperialist speeches about Hawaii, apparently, because we were going in and doing our American thing, taking over Hawaii from the kingdom that existed there. I don't know the whole history, but I do know that much. This was a topic that Van Dyke Parks was clearly interested in, and he was clearly interested in it in the context of SMiLE. So it seems likely that even though this track does not seem to have been part of the SMiLE lineup, it was part of this whole idea of going from Plymouth Rock to Hawaii that Van Dyke was envisioning with his Americana concept. So it fits in, sort of, but it never seems to have been in the running for SMiLE, but Brian brings it back for SMiLE. And actually, maybe that's why Brian brought it back for SMiLE, because clearly he wanted to forget a lot of what he and Van Dyke had done, and so maybe without the Mark Twain, probably Mark Twain subject matter, and changing it into a song about oral sex. He could sort of wash away the Van Dyke Parksness of it. I don't know. But anyway, he gives speeches. Actually, a really cool track. It's got a cool melody. It's got kind of a nice rockin' vibe. But anyway, the next track to be tracked on September 8th is a song that's called Holidays. And this is a one and done. Brian never came back to it again. It's quite a complex instrumental track with return to sort of the big band sound of Pet Sounds. It's got more of that John Philip Sousa vibe that we don't really hear again besides this track on the SMiLE album. And that may be why it seems to have never been considered for the album. It seems to have the same role as Trombone Dixie did for Pet Sounds. Brian just trying out an arrangement. But it did have new lyrics written for it in 2005, and it was 2004, I'm sorry, repurposed as a song called On a Holiday. And this is another complete songwriting thought. It's not fragmentary, and it's a complete take. Everything's in one take. It wasn't done in bits and pieces like a lot of the other songs were. It was mistitled for a long time on bootlegs as Tones or Tune X. Interestingly, Carl and Dennis play on this also, with most of the other instruments being the marimba, again back from wind chimes and woodwinds. So even though this has more of a big band sound, kind of like Pet Sounds, there's still a lot fewer instruments on it, and it's got a mix of the complexity. I'm talking about the songwriting structure of it. Some of it's complex and some of it is simple. The intro is quite intricate, and the chorus is two sets of two chords each. So again, that two chords bouncing around thing. The chorus is a very unusual bass at the top of the chorus. I think it's a major 7. I didn't sit down and check it, but it's very odd. And I believe Carl played the bass, but I remember reading a story, I think Carol Kay told it, about Lyle Ritz being driven insane by Brian on some track because Brian made him play a major 7. And to non-musicians, that doesn't make any sense, but basically, if you're playing a chord, you usually play the root, which is what we call the 1. And Brian was sort of famous for putting a 3 in the bass or 5 in the bass, but those are still notes in the chord. And then you've got other things like where you put a 2 and a 4 in the bass, which are more dissonant. But putting a major 7 in the bass means you're playing a half step below the root. So it's the most dissonant thing you can do. And as a bass player, I can see why it would have given Lyle Ritz a headache to play that, because it would have sounded completely wrong. I don't remember what interview I saw that in or what track that was referring to, but again, here we have what sounds to me like a major 7 in the bass opening the chorus, so quite dissonant. And even though the chorus is fairly simple relative to some of Brian's prior compositions, it starts out with this really weird bass note. There is a third section to Holidays that was used, and it was used as the tag, the fade out for wind chimes on the SMiLE. A song then called Intro to the Album, and later to be called Our Prayer, was tracked next on September 19th with a follow-up session on October 4th. And this is a cappella chorale piece that Brian intended. We can tell this from the studio chatter as an intro to the album. And at that time, Al Jardine suggests it could be its own track, but Brian rejects this, giving us another clue as to Brian's original concept for the album. Now, it's interesting that this was recorded twice in 2 different keys, indicating that Brian may have been adjusting the key to provide a better segue to his shifting ideas of what would open the album. Now, the 2 keys are C sharp and D sharp, and that because of the keys, those are the keys of Heroes and Villains and Good Vibrations, respectively. And we know Brian was going to put Good Vibrations on the album. The theorizing is that Brian at one point thought Heroes and Villains was going to be the first track, and so he recorded this in C sharp, Heroes and Villains key, and then he changed it to D sharp when he decided Good Vibrations was going to open the album. And to make it even more complicated, Michael Vossi, who is the one of Brian's entourage that seems to have the clearest idea, other than Van Dyke Parks, of how this album was supposed to go, has said that the album was supposed to close with the song Surf's Up, and then there was going to be a chorale piece after it as like an amen to the album. And that seems to describe this track. So that it also is possible that Brian, at another point, decided this was going to be the closing part of the album as the end of Surf's Up. There's some mystery as to how Surf's Up would have ended, whether the way it was ended in the release version was what it was supposed to be or not. We'll talk about that later. But another part of the mystery, where was our prayer going to be? What was it going to flow into? The answer most certainly is it depended on what day you asked Brian. But the track was roughly completed by December 66. And Brian made a comp reel of Work in Progress in December 66, which interestingly left the second to last passage out, at least apparently according to the version I was able to review on YouTube. But Our Prayer, of course, was eventually completed with additional vocal overdubs and a high note added by Bruce. I think Carl and Dennis also sang on it, and that was released on the album 2020 in 1969, and it later opened the Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE album in 2004. So this takes us into October 1966, and with Good Vibrations now in the can, Brian's focus fully turns to the new album, and the meat of the SMiLE project will occur during the next 3 months, a time when Good Vibrations is rising the charts, validating Brian's new direction, buttressing the group's popularity, and creating enormous curiosity about what the band's next release would be. Even though in theory, the SMiLE project was still viable as late as May 1967, the bulk of the action and the period where SMiLE was at its most cohesive, productive, and likely to bear fruit takes place in the last 3 months of 1966. So at the beginning of October, the album is underway in earnest, and an artist named Frank Holmes was given lyrics to the album to create an impressionistic, cartoon-like illustrated booklet to go inside the album, packaging which was unheard of at the time. This is something that happened later, but at that time, I mean, I think Sgt. Pepper's was the first album to actually have the lyrics, if I remember correctly, and that hadn't happened yet. So this was an emphasis. This emphasized the forward-thinking nature of the project, and in its own way, visually framing the ideas for the album as Brian and Van Dyke moved forward. Also, a new record label, Brother Records, was being set up by David Anderle to give Brian more creative freedom and the band the ability, theoretically, to produce outside artists. Also at that time, the Beatles' publicist, Derek Taylor, was brought on board to publicize the artistic effort and remake the Beach Boys, and especially Brian's, image to be more in tune with the times. Also on the sidelines with a regular recording, Brian started recording audio effects, verite recordings, dialogue, and skits that he envisioned might find a place in the album somehow. It's interesting how Van Dyke Parks characterized Brian's energy channeled into his lyrics as, quote, cartoon consciousness, as Van Dyke Parks' lyrics embody both his sophistication and Brian's naivete. And also hints again that at least some of Brian's inspiration was indirectly coming from watching TV. But Frank Holmes' illustrations sort of reinforced this whole cartoony idea that is part of the overall SMiLE zeitgeist, but you can see the concepts all piling up here. They all sort of go together, they all fit together somehow. That's sort of what SMiLE is. But anyway, October 3rd kicked off with a recording of the first section of one of the centerpiece compositions of SMiLE, Cabinessence. At this point, it was called Home on the Range, but that was really just the first part of this three-part composition. A stunning, kaleidoscopic, and cinematic mirage of a song that was composed of the first Home on the Range Doing Doing verse, not the official name, that's my name for it, which combined non-rock instruments like banjo and ominous sounding cello and these unique Doing Doing vocalizations in the background. The hard-driving B section, Who Ran the Iron Horse, with its eerie rising and falling vocal chorale and unsettling tick-tock percussion rhythm, and the stunning finale, the Grand Coulee section, with unwinding counterpoints of wordless vocals, bouzouki, rising cello, fuzz bass. Maybe my favorite piece of music ever recorded. It's just astounding, especially when you consider it was recorded in October 1966. It was all designed to conjure up a visual of a Chinese laborer driving a spike to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. So very high concept Americana idea from Van Dyke Parks, kind of going with the whole Americana, Old West, travel across the country kind of themes he was working with. As a weirdly specific and abstract image to put into a song, it all works. It's an incredible composition, possibly my favorite song from SMiLE. It's just an astounding recording. The parts had been edited together in their original form pretty early on, I think maybe even at that session, and its intricate backing vocals were all recorded by December 1966, but the lead vocals by Carl, and Dennis also buried deep in the mix, were apparently not added until 1968 when the song was completed and released on the 2020 album. Now we're going to start to see this is a running theme of Brian getting the songs almost done, and then the lead vocal for some reason is not recorded. And I think this is a very key part of unraveling the mystery of SMiLE, is this phenomenon. Anyway, according to Van Dyke Parks and Michael Vossi, this was not the way it was originally conceived, and the Who Ran the Iron Horse section was possibly to be combined with the Bicycle Rider section of Do You Like Worms? But I don't know. I mean, we've got Brian doing an edit this way by December 66, and this is how it was finished. So who made, was that, it doesn't seem to have been a decision made by the band after Brian abandoned the project. It seems to be the way Brian wanted it, at least at some point. But this goes back to this modular idea of recording where you'd have these sections, and you could theoretically take section B out of Cabin Essence and make it section C out of something else or whatever. This is just the way he put it together, but it works like crazy. And we're going to see this. You didn't always have sections together that worked like crazy, but in this song it really does. So I think, I think we might venture to assume that even though it might have been originally conceived in a different way, Brian realized that this was the way to put it together. Anyway, back to the band. Besides producing the eventual released version after Brian abandoned it, Carl also apparently played acoustic guitar on this track. So this is another example of the Beach Boys actually playing on the SMiLE album as opposed to just singing. Also significantly, notice we have now moved from harpsichord to piano as the bedrock instrument of the track. So the sound of the album has shifted a little bit. So with this song, Brian now had two songs that stood with his best work, which would be Cabin Essence and I Think Wonderful. With this track in particular being genuinely visionary in the context of 1966, the hype for the album, Brian had to be feeling pretty excited at this point because he's just got some incredible music going on here, and the people around it were hearing it, and these were all people with industry connections, Derek Taylor and David Anderle and Michael Vossi and even Van Dyke Parks. These were people that knew people, and the word was starting to get around, I think even more than with Pet Sounds, that Brian was doing something really incredible here. So that's an important part of the mythology that comes up out of this. Anyway, the next new song to get underway was the previously mentioned Child is the Father of the Man, which was a phrase nicked from a Wordsworth poem, which, again, Van Dyke Parks influencing Brian, who then takes the idea and, makes a song out of it. For this song, lyrics apparently were written but were never recorded, and unlike many of the SMiLE songs, this title does reflect, as I said, Brian's concerns, although coming through a Van Dyke Park idea, with both transitioning to adulthood and mental health. Once again, no lead vocal was recorded in 1966, even though the rest of the track, barring the lead vocals, sounds pretty close to done, at least in terms of where it was at in December 66. Anyway, Van Dyke Parks wrote new lyrics in 2004, so there is a completed version of the song, but it was not the lyrics that were originally intended for it. Parts of the chorus had already appeared in the track Look, which, again, is evidence that that song may not have been intended for the album, or that Look was intended to be a link piece or another part of Child is the Father of the Man. But there's evidence those two tracks are linked in some way, and were, as I said, linked that way in the Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE configuration of these tracks. Other parts of this song would be repurposed for 1968's Little Bird, which was a Dennis track, but Brian was not credited as co-writer, but parts of it are there, including the baby crying trumpet figure. And of course, the child is the father of the man hook was reconfigured to become the tag at the end of Surf's Up when it was released in 1971. And there's another big debate over whether that was originally how it was supposed to go. And there's some reports that Brian said it was, and then there's other reports where it's something that they just kind of tacked on and improvised to finish the song. Nobody knows. But you do hear the whole child is father the man chant at the end of Surf's Up, but this song, while it's similar, is its own song and it's different. So another weird mystery of this whole album. This is another track that is basically composed of two sections, which were again tracked separately and edited together, that themselves are composed of, again, two chord back and forth riffs. Like da 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 da. So this song was included on Brian's December 1966 track list and seems to have been intended for the final album, though, and again, as I said, significantly, everything seems to have been done but the lead vocals. Though the exact sequence of the different parts of the song seems to have been a little bit up in the air. And this, again, this is a piano-based track, and there was an early version that had more of an up-tempo kind of jazzy feel, especially on the verse, and then 4 days later, Brian comes back with the more familiar version that we have now, and it's got the fuzz bass and wah-wah, wah-wah, which is supposed to, again, imply a baby, which gets back to the childhood concept, on the chorus. And then the verse is being pushed by multiple guitars with the piano kind of buried back in the mix. And then you have my favorite part of this, which is the apocalyptic sounding bridge, the do-do-da-da-do-do-da, which is the piano and then the lone trumpet going over it. Pretty intense sound, and it's echoed a little bit in a much later song called Time, which is on Dennis Wilson's Pacific Ocean Blues solo album. So it's possible. I mean, I can't say they're exactly the same, but they're very similar. So Dennis seems to have borrowed quite a bit from this track himself. There was also an odd fragment of this re-recorded in April 1967, which again was a point where Brian had stopped work on most of these tracks. And on that re-recorded version, there was an intro, like a couple of chords that suggest it may have been a tag or meant to go together with a song called I Love to Say Dada, which later became Cool Cool Water. Though that session happened at the same time as the tracking for a new version of Wonderful. So again, where does this song fit? We don't know the lyrics. It seems to be connected to Look, but we don't know how this was supposed to work because Look wasn't on or Iran wasn't on the final track listing, but this was. We have these bits and pieces of the song that turn up later. You know, it's hard to say, but but it does seem that it was mostly done by December '66 with backing vocals and everything, but it just lacked the lead vocal, which was written but not recorded. That is significant. I am going to talk about that in a little bit because I think there's a reason for that. Now, the next track to be begun, sort of, was Vegetables. And with this track, we enter into the more uncertain realms of the album, as if we didn't have enough uncertainty already. Similar to He Gives Speeches with its minimal arrangement, odd rhythms and pounding piano, this is a comic, pun-filled ode to eating healthy. The strange spelling, because it's VEGA-TABLES, has been suggested by some message board folks that this is a pun on the star Vega, which ties into astrology in some way I don't really understand. I'm willing to believe that. It seems to fit in with all the other stuff. But anyway, this version tracked in October contains some unreleased lyrics. What is unreleased at this point? I don't know. But anyway, there's some lyrics that were not heard on any future versions of this song that refer to a cornucopia. They're actually pretty cool lyrics. So people call this the cornucopia version because of that. But this was seemingly just a demo, although it contained extensive backing vocals, so I don't know. But as part of the humorous concept that was one of the working flows of the album, Brian also did a couple of spoken word sessions, and I'm going to talk about them again in a little bit, including a memorable one with Hal Blaine the following month that seemingly tied into the song, but proper work on the song itself did not start until January 1967. So in other words, Brian does this demo of Vegetables, then he does all these weird little skits that seem to tie into Vegetables, which is interesting because it's on his mind. But he doesn't actually start the track till January 67, and at that point, most of the work had halted on the rest of the album. So it's also interesting. And there is speculation that Vegetables started out as the Earth section of what Brian had conceived as a 4-part suite representing the elements. And that is backed up by Frank Holmes linking them in the artwork. Now, I'm going to talk about elements at length later, so just sort of peg in that and remember it. But it's worth noting that both the elements and Vegetables are listed independently on Brian's December 1966 track listing. And I'm going to keep going back to this track listing, and that's maybe a little controversial, but when that track listing was made, they printed up a whole bunch of booklets and album covers based on that track listing. And it came at a time when the album was closest to being fully conceived and finished. There's a point where Brian gets as close as he's ever going to get to finishing the album, and then while he continues to record for months after that, he gets further and further away from actually finishing it. So I think we have to put a lot of weight on that track listing. And it is the biggest clue we have as to what Brian was planning to do. And Vegetables and the elements are linked in the album booklet, which was in October, but in December, by December, he's conceiving them as 2 separate tracks. So if it started out being the Earth part of the elements, it didn't seem to wind up being the Earth part of the elements. But anyway, oddly, with this track, as 1967 progressed and Brian abandoned most of his work on the album, barring his quest to make Heroes and Villains the follow-up single to Good Vibrations, at a certain point, there's this whole flurry of activity recording this song, which had been barely worked on up to that point. And then Brian does a lot of work, many, many sessions on Vegetables during a short period of time, I think in April. I don't have it right in front of me, but it's fairly late in the game. And this is because at that time, Brian apparently pivoted to Vegetables as a single, which, you know, if you heard the song, is kind of a crazy thing to do. It's you know, it's certainly odd. It's almost like a Dr. Demento kind of track, and it's not representative of either the complexity or the depth of the other songs in the album. This seems to have been the impetus, or one of the impetuses, spur of impetus, I don't know. But this seems to have pissed Van Dyke Parks off, and it seems to be one of the reasons he finally left the project for good. Can't blame him, because it's kind of an insane idea and an example of how questionable Brian's decision-making had become by the end of this project. But it's interesting that when Brian is in that position, which we're going to talk a lot about in the next video in this series, of trying to figure out how to get a single out, that Brian doesn't reach back to any of the songs that he has already started or that he is about to start that are more nearly finished, and instead works on a song that he had hardly worked on up to that point. I think that's also significant, so that's very interesting. But anyway, Vegetables, unlike most of the songs of the album, had very little work done on it by December 66, but it had a whole lot of work done on it much later. So this is an outlier in terms of the SMiLE sessions and also in terms of the overall sound of the album, because it's basically just piano and effects. Paul McCartney famously supposedly chewed on a celery stick in one of the later sessions. And when it winds up on the SMiLE album in reimagined form, the music is just one note on the bass. So there you go. An odd, minimalist little novelty track that gets a lot of attention late in the game on this project. The very next day, Brian starts another track, and that further deepens the mystery of SMiLE. The track, supposedly, although there's some dispute about this, was titled Do You Like Worms? And there's some fun little worm imagery on Frank Holmes's cartoon insert that backed up this titling. But this was another track with lyrics that discuss the colonization of America, and these lyrics were not lost. I'll get to that in a minute. But like several tracks so far, this progressed as far as backing vocals, but no lead vocal by December 1966. So those lyrics were lost until they were rediscovered for the 2004 Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE project. Now, I think maybe they were getting the lyrics from the lyrics they gave to Frank Holmes, and that's where they found this. And this, they were trying to read the lyrics that Van Dyke Parks had written for it, and they couldn't read a word. So this prompted a call to Van Dyke Parks to ask him what the word was. It was Indians, by the way. And this was the impetus, there's that word again, impetus. This was the impetus for him rejoining the project and finishing up some of the other songs. So, very significant event in the completion of the album 38 years later. Nobody could recall the origin of the title and why it was called Do You Like Worms? And this is another big mystery, but to me, I think this mystery is kind of solved, even though none of the participants remembers, because I don't remember who did this or when it was posted, but somebody on Reddit came up with a theory that I think is striking, and I think it's right. Now, the song's chorus goes rock, rock, roll, Plymouth Rock, roll over. And as I said already, this goes with the theme of American colonization, the move westward, and the travelogue from the East Coast to Hawaii, right? So this, unusually for its time, one of the themes of the album is American colonialization. And we would see this pop up again in Carl Wilson's song, The Traitor. How does this deal with Do You Like Worms? Well, the Reddit commenter just very simply asked, what do you see when you turn over a rock? Worms. Do you like worms? The song's chorus goes rock, rock, roll, Plymouth Rock, roll over. And what you see when you roll over the rock is worms. In other words, the nasty underbelly of how America came to be America is the worm. And asking, do you like worms? Is like when you turn over the mythology of Plymouth Rock, you see the evil and horror that took place to become the United States of America that we're all living in, sort of unconscious of how much it was on the backs of the people that came before us. And I think that's right. I think that has to be what Van Dyke Parks was thinking. I think he just forgot, because that explanation just lines up perfectly for me. Now, other people, I think Al Jardine and Bruce Johnson both said that was never the name of the song. It's called Roll Plymouth Rock, and that's how it was eventually released on Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. But clearly at some point, Do You Like Worms was operative, or else Frank Holmes wouldn't have put worms in his cartoon. So I think given the themes that Van Dyke Parks was interested in exploring, and he talked about it with Hawaii and stuff like that, I think this is what Do You Like Worms means. It's like you're rolling over the Plymouth Rock and you're seeing the hidden underbelly of the American manifest destiny and the American dream and the prosperous American lifestyle that came after Westerners colonized. So I think that's the answer, and I think it's a great answer. I wish I knew what Redditor made that comment. If you happen to see this video, put yourself in the comments and give yourself credit, because I think that was brilliant. Anyway, Do You Like Worms was the first song on Brian's 1966 track list. And when I say Brian's 1966 track list, it was not in Brian's handwriting. It was believed to have been given to Capitol Records by either Carl or Diane Ravel, Brian's sister-in-law and the contractor for the SMiLE sessions. But almost certainly it was something Brian dictated to get Capitol off his back. It should be acknowledged, as many people point out, that Brian would have felt under no obligation to adhere to this track list just because Capitol Records spent thousands of dollars printing up jackets with those titles on them. But at the same time, I think we can be fairly sure that's where he thought the album was at whatever time he dictated it. We don't know the exact timeline of when that song list was done. We know it was turned into Capitol around the 10th or 15th of December, around that time. So late November, early December is a good guess, although some people have said it was as early as October, but I don't believe that myself. Anyway, musically the song consists of 3 sections, each once again mostly being 2-chord vamps. So the rock Plymouth roll section, roughly a verse and a chorus, that represents the East Coast part of the journey across the U.S. And then we have the bicycle rider section, which was later repurposed as the chorus to Heroes and Villains, represents the movement westward, while the Erie, Wahana, Pule section represents arrival in Hawaii. So you see again how all the musical parts of it, even though we didn't have the lyrics, how each part of the song geographically represents a different part of the story Van Dyke is trying to tell. So this song was seemingly a completed edit, barring once again the vocals, as of December 1966. Musically, the verse is driven by pounding drums alternating with a bass break. The bicycle rider section returns to the eerie music box harpsichord sound, and then we have more ominous sounding, this time slide guitar, implying the whole Hawaii thing, on the bridge vocal section. The only part of the lead vocal that was ever recorded was for the bicycle rider section, and that was recorded at that time because it was going to be part of Heroes and Villains. So interestingly, once again, like as of December 66, we don't have vocals, but January 67, we are now working on Heroes and Villains, so we put vocals on this one part. As I said, they did dig up the lyrics for this, unlike the other songs where they had lost the lyrics and they made new ones in 2004. So we do have the original vintage lyrics on the Roll Plymouth Rock version that came out in 2004. But interestingly, on a snippet of session tape, Brian appears to sing a different melody for the verse, for the first line of the verse. And it's much more interesting melody than the 2004 melody, which is fairly monotonous relative to the melodies Brian was doing in 66. And so it's another intriguing clue as to what had it been intended in 66. But it does appear that even though the lyrics for the Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE version are vintage, that the melody is not. Next to be started is one of the biggest puzzles of the SMiLE saga, the song that arguably drove Brian insane. The original tracking of Heroes and Villains, although it wasn't the original tracking, and this is something I've tried to get clarity on and failed, because apparently there was a May version of Heroes and Villains that is now lost, and that's back in like just post Pet Sounds, which doesn't really make much sense because Brian had not started writing with Van Dyke at that point. Van Dyke very clearly talks about how Heroes and Villains was first or second song, I think it was the first, that they worked on. So how is it possible Brian's tracking it in May, but they're writing it in July or August, something like that. And so as far as I can tell, what we've got here is musician Al Cooper, who was floating around sessions at the time, obviously, heard the May session, and he said it was a bizarre reimagining of You Are My Sunshine, which also was later re-recorded for SMiLE in kind of a strange way. And then if you look carefully into the songwriting process that Van Dyke Parks and Brian did for Heroes and Villains, it seems like Brian played Van Dyke a progression to which Van Dyke spat out these lyrics, which were inspired by Marty Robbins' El Paso. It's got a similar storyline to it. And so if you look at that carefully, it seems like Brian already had the progression and Van Dyke just wrote to it. So what I'm guessing is, especially based on the instrumentation, which is your standard rocky instrumentation for that May session, that what Brian had done is he had that same 4-chord progression for Heroes and Villains for the verse, that somehow he interpolated You Are My Sunshine either over that chord progression or he had that chord progression lead into it. And when he got into SMiLE, he disassociated those thoughts and turned You Are My Sunshine into a different track. That's my guess. And I suspect this is actually known, but I wasn't able to find anyone who said this, so this is my reconstruction of how this played out. So anyway, there was some form of Heroes and Villains as early as May, but it doesn't seem to have been the Heroes and Villains we know and love, and it's certainly not the Van Dyke Parks storyline. So anyway, this is the first of many sessions in Heroes and Villains. It's going to become a big part of part 2, and so I'm not going to get too far in the musical structure of this, particularly because it's very, very clear Brian had a verse, which was a great verse, and then he didn't know what was going to happen after that. We have a Brian piano demo that he performed for a DJ named Humble Harv, where he does the verse and then he interpolates two other fragments that were later spun off into tracks. One was called Barnyard. Out in the barnyard, the chickens do their number. And another part called I'm in Great Shape. Like, happy air around my head, morning stumble out of bed. But really, these songs, they're not even full verses. They're like fragments. I think Barnyard's 59 seconds long, and I'm in Great Shape is less. But so at that time, they were parts of Heroes and Villains. So you got the verse, and then it went into these other two parts. But even when Brian's playing the demo of his imagining for Heroes and Villains to Humble Harv, which happened around this time, I can't remember I don't have the exact timeline of when the Humble Harv demo was. Actually, I'm going to check that real quick. When was the Humble Harv demo? AI draws a blank. See, AI is useless. But even when he's playing the demo for Humble Harv, Brian's a little vague. He's like, wait, what's this next part? Oh yeah, it goes like this. And he plays a bit of Barnyard, and he plays his other part. So even Brian seems a little shaky on how this is supposed to go. Okay, since AI didn't have a clue, I had to go back and check. Sorry, I should have had this in the notes. So let me explain how this went down, because it's important understanding this whole sequence of events. So the demo for Humble Harv the DJ, where Brian interpolates these three tracks together, Heroes and Villains, Barnyard, I'm in Great Shape, happened on November 4th. And at the original sessions, which took place a week or two before that, and so Brian tracks the verse for Heroes and Villains and Barnyard on the same day, Barnyard being part of Heroes and Villains, and he very shortly thereafter tracks I'm in Great Shape. So at that point, late October and early November, they're all part of the same song. So by the end of December 1966's track listing, I'm in Great Shape is listed as a separate track, but Barnyard is not. So since each one is too short to be a free-form song, it's assumed that these were intended to be reconnected in Brian's modular style with a few other similar fragments, and fan reconstructions of the album have tended to follow this pattern. So on Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE, Barnyard is included as a minute-long freestanding track, immediately followed by, but not connected to, the fragment, the old master painter / You Are My Sunshine, which in itself is a combination of fragments, although I think they were tracked together, covering two pre-rock standards. While I'm in Great Shape on Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE is combined with the other SMiLE fragments, I Want to Be Around and Workshop, also known as Friday Night. So, so here's where things get really squirrely, okay? Because for those keeping score, so we have Heroes and Villains, which is a verse. Then we have Barnyard and I'm in Great Shape, which were going to be part of Heroes and Villains, just as the Grand Coulee and Who Ran the Iron Horse were going to be part of Cabin Essence, right? So it's the same kind of idea Brian had with a lot of these. I got three parts that are all going to go together, okay? So at some point, Brian at least decides I'm in Great Shape, and probably both of these are going to get spun out into their own track, whereas he's going to keep the verse of Heroes and Villains, and something's going to come after that, and that something becomes a big headache for Brian. But anyway, so what was going to happen to Barnyard? What was going to happen to I'm in Great Shape? So there's some evidence that the sequence on Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE is vintage, because Great Shape was written on the tape box apparently for I Want to Be Around and Friday Night when they were tracked. We'll get to them in a minute. This is getting really complicated. But there's no indication that the minute-long Barnyard was ever planned to be a freestanding track. And with its Western feel and animal noises, it certainly fit in with the Americana concept. So it was probably planned as a module, but once it was out of Heroes and Villains, where was it supposed to go? That probably changed. So was it supposed to go with I'm in Great Shape? Like when Brian, by December 66, Heroes and Villains is this, I'm in Great Shape is that. What was going to be what was I'm in Great Shape going to be? Because the I'm in Great Shape we got is like 30 seconds long or something. So Brian said in 1978 he had planned to have 4 different sections comprise a suite built around Barnyard. So that indicates Barnyard might have been incorporated with some of the other fragments or riffs that were lost or never recorded, or among these other fragments. There apparently was a lost session in December 66 that might have cleared up this question, or it might not. There are likewise apparently missing sections of I'm in Great Shape, but despite being on the December track listing, it doesn't appear to have been worked on after October, at which point it was still part of Heroes and Villains. So I'm going to get to some of these tracks later, but basically we're starting to get into the area where we have little pieces that we don't know where they fit together. So, but it seems likely that some of these were supposed to go together, and some of them, in fact, did at the end. But the I'm in Great Shape was on the track listing, even though it's even shorter than Barnyard. Barnyard's only a minute long. It's not in the track listing. Once they're spun out of Heroes and Villains, who knows? And after December 66, Heroes and Villains started sucking up other fragments, and that's where things get cattywampus. But anyway, beginning in November, now we get into a song that compositionally makes a lot more sense, and in fact, perhaps the most legendary track from SMiLE, Surf's Up. Now widely regarded as one of Brian's very finest and most ambitious compositions, and it was intended, as I said before, as the album's closer. Unlike the two-chord vamps of many of the SMiLE songs, this returns to the ambitious and highly unorthodox chord structures of Pet Sounds, but this time again with more space and a darker feel. Brian pointed out at the time that it starts on a minor seventh, which is pretty unusual then and now. Split into two movements with a third movement fade out that on, as I said before, the finished Surf's Up version, because it was completed by Carl in 1971 using bits and pieces from SMiLE. They use an interpolation, but not the original track of Child is the Father of the Man, but we do not know how Brian was going to end Surf's Up. It might have ended with Our Prayer, might have ended with Child is the Father of the Man, might have ended with something else. He might not have even known. Seems to have been up in the air in November 66. Brian only at that time was able to record the first movement with session musicians. And again, a lot of musicians, but a more stripped down sound with its car key, percussion, and glockenspiel that sounds, in Brian's words, just like jewelry. And the basic track for the first movement of Surf's Up is, again, stunning, especially in the context of what other people were doing in 66. It's another one of those tracks that, especially through the gauze of history and the many generations of gunk on bootlegs that we heard back in the 80s, furthered the mystery and the mystique of this album. Like, this was just incredible music. Now, whether Brian ever did a full-blown session for the second movement is one of the most hotly debated mysteries about SMiLE. The best evidence is that he did not. There is a lost session for Surf's Up where he may have recorded the second movement, but the best available evidence was that it was probably for something else. What we do know is that if Brian ever did record the second movement of SMiLE with studio musicians for a proper session, it has never been found, despite persistent efforts to locate it. The version that was released in 1971 was an amalgam of the first movement that Brian recorded, plus part of a piano version that Brian did for a Leonard Bernstein special that visited the recording sessions for SMiLE, plus some new recording in 1971. So it was a bit of a Frankenstein's monster. It's what they had to work with, because even in 71 they could not find the second movement tape, if it ever existed at all. That being said, even the bastardized 1971 version is a masterpiece, and many kudos to Carl for doing yeoman work, getting a fully realized version of this song to the marketplace. We can quibble that it is not exactly as Brian would have envisioned it. Brian has spoken of, he planned to do a string arrangement for the second half, and they did some approximation of this for the 2004 release of the song, but be that as it may, the 1971 version of Surf's Up is magnificent as it is. So kudos to both Brian and Carl. The next song in the queue for November was the previously mentioned fragment of a medley combining the 1949 standard The Old Master Painter, verse of it anyway. And You Are My Sunshine, now called You Were My Sunshine. Seemingly that was carried over, at least as a concept, from the first version of Heroes and Villains. Now, there was a vocal recorded for You Were My Sunshine, but the first half, which was, I think the most famous version was done by Frank Sinatra. I'm not sure, but Frank Sinatra definitely did it. Was just instrumental, led by a cello and backed by pizzicato strings. And apparently, Brian only used the verse because it's all he could remember. So why Brian put these two songs together, or how it fit in with us all, again, it's another one of these puzzling things. I mean, he actually put a bit of a doo-wop song in a later version of Heroes and Villains. So Brian was pulling stuff out of the pre-rock vernacular into the SMiLE project, and the best guess is that this is another part of the Americana concept of Van Dyke's, to get into the Great American Songbook. But anyway, so the second half is sung by Dennis, and it's a strangely gloomy cover of the 1939 standard, You Are My Sunshine. This is fragmentary, and it's hard to understand how this all fit in with everything, but the Old Master Painter is included on Brian's December 1966 track list, but initially in parentheses that were later crossed out. So does that imply that it was a maybe, and then Brian committed to it? It seems like whoever had this dictated to them, Brian said, maybe we're going to have the Old Master Painter, and then realizing that he had to give 12 tracks to Capitol, just told whoever was taking the dictation to cross out the parentheses. That's my best guess. But once again, it does seem like this fragment, which again consists itself of two fragments of cover songs, basically, doesn't seem to have been long enough to be its own track. So what was it going to be combined with, or was it? Was it just going to be a really small little thing that nonetheless had its own banding? Nobody knows. One of the biggest mysteries of SMiLE is, where did these little tiny link tracks that nonetheless seem to be part of the running order, how did they all fit together? Nobody knows, and maybe Brian didn't know either, but they were in the mix. Now, what's interesting about this to me is that we have a lead vocal for it. We have all these songs that were basically complete, barring lead vocals, by December 66. But this is one of the few where there actually was a vocal cut. Why? And I have a strong suspicion that's one of the keys to unraveling the mystery of SMiLE, because I don't think it's a coincidence. There's nothing controversial about You Are My Sunshine. It's a song my mom sang to me when I was a little kid. Audrey might have sung it to Brian, So no one was going to object to singing You Are My Sunshine. They might go, why are we doing this? But there was nothing controversial about the lyrics to You Are My Sunshine, other than him changing it to the past tense. So we have all these tracks. Like how many we got? Cabin Essence, Child's the Fire of the Man, Do You Like Worms? Might even be one more. I can't remember now. It's getting late. They're basically done, barring the lead vocal, in December 66. Why no vocal? I think when we look at the history of the sessions, it's very clear that December 66 is the month it all starts to break down. And one of the factors in that was the band putting their vocals on the tracks and Brian encountering resistance to what was happening. And yet we have many, many backing vocals to, I think we have backing vocals to all of these tracks. So the band was working on them. And I think Brian was delaying putting lead vocals on these songs because he anticipated resistance to the lyrics from the band. Think of the songs that we have lead vocals for. We've got Carl sings on Wind Chimes. That's a fairly benign lyric. In fact, it may have been written before Van Dyke was even in the picture, songwriting-wise. And we have Wonderful, which Brian sings, so there's no controversy there. We know that Mike objected to the tag lyrics to Cabin Essence, Over and Over the Crow Flies and Cover the Cornfield. if Brian even had trouble getting Mike to sing like a tagline, he must have been thinking, how the hell am I going to get these guys, get lead vocals out of Al or Mike or maybe even Carl? Because I haven't really talked that much about where the band stood with the SMiLE project, and I'll get into that more in part 2, but it does seem like only Dennis was solidly behind it. It does seem like even Carl had some reservations about it. And I think that's the reason we don't have lead vocals for a lot of these songs that are otherwise complete. Brian was leaving this to the end because he knew it was going to be a problem. Yes, because of Brian's recording style, because of the way he's editing it together, he had to wait till the end to do the vocals because he didn't have completed tracks for a lot of this stuff. But a lot of these tracks, the backing vocals seem kind of done. Like they're all the way to the ending point other than the lead vocal. And I think that's the reason. I think Brian is just like, he didn't want to confront them with Van Dyke's lyrics to the last possible minute because he didn't want a headache to it. And I think that's reluctance to take that step with the guys. It's one of many things that happened in December '66 that made Brian shift his focus away. But I don't think it's a coincidence that so many of these songs lack lead vocals. I think it's because Brian was afraid of the band's reaction when they had to sing them. Oh, one thing I forgot to say about The Old Master Painter and You Are My Sunshine is musically the song is mostly strings with a little bit of percussion and a very incongruous horn break at the end. But there's a little effect of the strings kind of falling down a hole that happens at the end, and Brian later repurposed that for a version of Heroes and Villains, which again is an example of him stealing parts of songs to try and complete the single, which will become very relevant in part 2. So we come to November 28th, which every observer pegs as the turning point of the project. Brian conducts a notorious session for another new song called Fire, or Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, which was itself conceived as 1/4 of the Element Suite, which was to be 4 pieces cut together that represented fire, earth, water, and air. And this is one of the biggest mysteries and controversies of SMiLE. What was supposed to be in this? Where are the other tracks? I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but right now we're just going to focus on Fire because that is the one part of the Element Suite that we know was supposed to be there. So this is perhaps the most notorious and well-publicized session of the whole SMiLE incident. Brian had composed an instrumental that was basically the musical representation of fire. And let's recall that one of Brian's big interests at this time was music that was cinematic. It told a pictorial story, and his biggest success with this was with Cabin Essence, where he's got this image of the spike being driven in by the Chinese laborer on the Transcontinental Railroad, and he managed to vividly conjure that up with the whole Grand Coulee Dam section, and you can see that, and you can kind of, and with the instrumental effects, you can sort of hear the hot air rising up off the desert sand. It's really incredible. And Brian does himself one better here by making music that does represent fire. And he actually did tape fire burning as well, but just the music on its own gives off that vibe. And he actually, at the session, he was in a very playful mood. He gave all the musicians fire hats to wear, which some of them didn't really like, but that's what he did. And so Brian was in a party mode. And I think Brian approaching this track with in such a jovial mood is relevant to why his mood changed later. But many feel that this session and its aftermath were the point where SMiLE's good vibrations turned bad. Because as lore would have it, a building near the studio burnt down a few days after the session, and Brian, in his increasingly paranoid state, he thought he had cosmically caused the fire, and as a result wanted to scrap the track. And in fact, many witnesses at the time say he did destroy it, although we do have it, so he wasn't completely successful. There are some accounts that say he tried to set fire to the tapes and they wouldn't burn. Who knows? Okay, but it's clear that Brian went into this session all happy and go lucky and cut this track. And I think the sound of the music and the vibrations that it brought to his increasingly stressed out psyche were bad. I think the music that he made scared him. And think about somebody in Brian's fragile state at that time creating something that comes out of you that scares you. I think this is psychically important because Brian had mental issues that were increasingly taking over his brain, right? And I think unconsciously, the fact that he conjured up something so scary and then heard it play back to him, I think more than having the building burned down on the street, I think that subconsciously might have been what started to freak him out and started to freak him out about his whole exploration of this kind of music. The music was so out there and so advanced, so ahead of its time, so away from the mainstream. I think having that manifest out of Brian and then having Brian play it back and the darkness that was starting to seep into it and the repetitiveness, and I think this is a hidden part of why the music made Brian so uncomfortable and why he began to turn against it from this point on. I think Fire most clearly showed to Brian that there was something in him that was coming out, and there was a thread inside his music that had not been there so much before, or if it had been there, it was under some kind of control. The melancholy, the darkness, the sense of isolation and fear. I think, just like Alan Boyd said, you hear this in the kind of the back and forth and the repetitiveness and the sonic weirdness and eeriness of a lot of these tracks. I think at this point, Brian started to hear that and relate it to what was going on inside his head, his increasing loss of control, his increasing inability to control his impulses, his fragmenting focus, even if he wasn't completely aware of what was happening in terms of the way that other people perceived him. Think of what it must have been like to be in such a pressure position, have so many people relying on you, and think of what it's like when you're starting to feel like you no longer have control over your faculties. I think when people think about why did Brian make all this incredible music, and then why was he so against it for so many years? I think you have to relate them to one another. I mean, history is full of bands that made worthy albums, but the bands themselves hate it because of the bad memories that the recording process evoked for them. That was clearly the case from Brian, but I think it goes deeper. I think the darkness that overtook Brian, you hear it in the music. And I think the reason he was so happy when SMiLE came out later was it was now related to positivity. And there's a lot of positivity in this music. There's a lot of joy in this music. There's a lot of celebration in this music. There's a lot of humor in this music. I think once Brian finished SMiLE in a way that was more jovial, and actually the new additions to SMiLE, even though we can argue about whether they were as good as the vintage stuff, they're a little more positive. You know, the darkness isn't really so much there. It's kind of pat to say that SMiLE, the release and finishing of it in 2004, healed Brian. And it's the kind of easy Hollywood answer we tend to reject. But I think there's some truth to it, and I think that's why. I think Brian, because it happened concurrently with with a breakdown that for Brian was in some ways irrevocable. Like the darkest period of his life in some ways. I mean, there were darker times to follow, but this is where things just started to slide into oblivion for Brian, and he never came back to who he was, ever. But he was able to reclaim that and turn it into a positive thing, and I can see how for the rest of his life that had to have lifted a lot of weight off him. And sorry, that's a kind of a late night musing that wasn't in my notes, but I think it might be the most meaningful part of this whole video, that little thought stream. But anyway, let us continue as we move past this. It's worth mentioning that the Fire music, when it was reproduced on Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE, won Brian his first Grammy for Best Instrumental Performance. But one puzzling thing about the whole Brian burning the fire tapes thing is the Elements is on the track listing Brian gave to Capitol. We don't know the timing of it, but Capitol got it second week of December, roughly. So if Brian decided he was dumping Fire, that track listing must have been submitted either just after the session or not long before it. And it's one of these mysteries, like if Brian really was going to get rid of the Elements section, would it have been on that track listing? It's hard to say, but it's very curious, and it's suggestive of the timing, because all the stuff that's on the track listing indicates it was the stuff he was working on around the end of November, with the exception of Vegetables, which was just in sort of a demo state. But if he's talking about getting rid of Fire and burning the tapes, as early as December, I mean, that's concurrent with that list being turned in. So how much was he really going to get rid of the Elements? Was he planning to redo Fire? I mean, he did talk about, he didn't say he was actually going to get rid of the Elements. He said something like, I don't have to do a big scary fire like that. The next fire I do is going to be a candle. So he may have just wanted to keep the Elements and reconfigure it as something a little less terrifying to him. But at the same time was going to run out on the project, at least the productive part of it, fairly quickly. So he may never have had time to work this question out. At any rate, the following day from the Fire sessions, Brian tracked another puzzling fragment, and again, I alluded to it earlier, another partial cover of a pre-rock, well, actually not pre-rock, because it was a recent hit, but it was not a rock song. It was a jazz pop hit called I Want to Be Around, and again, just part of it. And the session of which was preceded with a pretty impressive little jazz jam that the studio musicians just improvised on the spot. But anyway, I Want to Be Around was followed by a piece that, again, I previously referred to called Workshop, which is also called Friday Night. And that was later overdubbed with hammering and construction noises. Now, during the session tapes, Carol Kay states, it's what happens after the fire. And she seems to be talking about her little jam session because she was fresh from the Fire session the night before. But it is believed that given the proximity of the Fire session, the idea behind the fragment with its hammering and construction noises was to signify the rebuilding after the fire. Though, as I said before, the tape box suggests it might form the missing remainder of I'm in Great Shape, which again, this gets us back to the track listing that we've got, which has I'm in Great Shape as part of the master track listing and Barnyard not. And it seems to date from around this time, late November, early December. So that's a little further evidence, in my view, that I'm in Great Shape, I Want to Be Around, and Workshop / Friday Night were all supposed to be part of the track listing. Because this track, I'm sorry, it's 2 in the morning and it's confusing even me. This track, meaning I Want to Be Around / Workshop, aka Friday Night, is not on the handwritten track listing. And so that does suggest it was meant to be folded into another track at that point. Or possibly was thought of by Brian after the track listing was written, because as I said, it was submitted around the 10th or 15th of December as far as we can tell. On the Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE sequence, this I Want to Be Around / Workshop, aka Friday Night fragment, opens the third movement with the fire following several songs afterward. So in the final 2004 organization of this album, there's no relationship between this and fire. That brings us to December, which is the last month of the productive work on most of the album. So the last 2 songs proper that were begun, the first one is called You're Welcome, and this was a simple vocal round recorded on the same day as overdubs for several other songs with basic instrumentation centered around a big thumping drum and a celeste, which was probably provided by the Wilson brothers. It's doubtful it was ever intended for the SMiLE album, and nobody really seems to know what it was meant for. But because of its simplistic nature, it doesn't seem to fit. It doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that would go with anything else, unless it was the who knows. I was just thinking maybe it was going to be the thing that came after Surf's Up, but basically nobody knows. But what it was finally used for was the B-side for Heroes and Villains when it was finally released in July 1967. And as such, it remained one of the few publicly available and released samples of the mysterious SMiLE sessions for many, many years. Finally, we get to the last track, which is I Love to Say Da-Da, which was at first just called Da-Da, and that was begun on December 22nd. Though, like Vega-Tables, the bulk of the work on this track would take place much later into 1967. So this is another outlier. In fact, this was the last track that was worked on for the SMiLE recordings in May of 67, which again, kind of odd. And it's also interesting that, like Vega-Tables, at the end of the sessions, Brian cast back to a song that was barely worked on during the bulk of the sessions, and he didn't touch any of the songs that he had nearly finished. So there are many theories about the origin of this song. It definitely began life as a song about a baby, and that's where the da-da comes in. Although it turns into a Hawaiian chant, wa wa hoa, at some point, which ties in with Van Dyke Parks' other Hawaiian concepts. But it eventually evolved over time into a song called Cool Cool Water, and this is after the SMiLE sessions. And it was first worked on under that title in late 1967. And it eventually was finished along with some other fragments from 67 and some new recordings as Cool Cool Water on the 1970 Sunflower album. But this song was not included on the handwritten track listing, which was submitted before this session. But because of the sound of the track, the timing of the recording of the track, and its evolution into Cool Cool Water, it has been theorized by many that this was supposed to be the water section of the Elements. Though Brian's cousin Michael Vossi believes nature recordings of running water Brian asked him to make might have been intended to make up this session, with Brian editing the pitches of the water together to make a song, which would have been a very arduous editing process on an album that was full of arduous editing processes to come. So there's a pretty good chance this is just kind of an idea that Brian had and was never going to follow through on. But at the time of the Elements being conceived, it seems certain that this riff that Brian used for this song was written. In fact, I think Marilyn, Brian's wife, dated it back to spring of 67, the piano riff. And there's even the story of Brian asking Marilyn to give him a bottle of chocolate milk while he's writing the song to get in the feel of being a baby. And I find this anecdote very disturbing, because this is another song from this album that seems to be about regression. So, and it's interesting, Brian starts it right at the point when he's starting to pull away from the project or starting to lose confidence in it. So he starts work on this song, which is in fairly rudimentary form. He uses Fender Rhodes electric piano as the basis of the track, which I think taped reeds. And actually, it's not an instrument Brian used an awful lot, so that in itself is interesting. But anyway, whatever its provenance and whether it was intended for SMiLE or not, but this song is kind of an outlier because it comes after the track listing for SMiLE. It is only sort of worked on in piecemeal demo form or very basic form before Brian changes his focus to work on Heroes and Villains, and then Brian returns to it almost at the end of the process. Again, like I said before, like Vega-Tables, reaching back to the two most fragmentary, least finished parts of the original project and bringing them to the fore at the very end of the project right before he abandons it. Very strange. But anyway, it seems to have started out with the baby concept, and then there's a little bit of the Hawaiian vibe going into it with the wah wah hoa thing, and then it winds up being water. So all of these ideas that Brian was having, with the childhood idea, and then the Hawaii idea, and then the Elements idea, wind up being incorporated into this song, but they don't seem to have been intended as part of the Elements at the time they were done. It was more like an afterthought for Brian. And that takes us through all of the tracks, at least the ones that we can identify as individual songs or things that seem like individual songs or things that had their own names that comprise the SMiLE project that we know of. And remember, there are some lost sessions and some lost tapes, and there may be, almost certainly are, missing pieces to this puzzle that we do not have and may never have. But we do need to talk more about the biggest missing piece of the puzzle, one I've already alluded to several times, which is the elements. This 4-part suite of songs that were intended to represent fire, air, earth, and water. That was definitely part of the track listing Brian delivered to Capitol, or that was delivered to Capitol under Brian's approval. We know that the fire tapes were originally intended to be the fire part of this. What was the rest of it? This is probably the most hotly debated question among people that study the mystery of SMiLE. So talking more about that, so Brian indicated that, I think in the 70s and maybe again later, that Air was a piano instrumental that went unrecorded, or actually the way he phrased it, it's not clear whether it was unrecorded or he had recorded it but just dropped work on it. And this has fueled speculation, since people have tried to figure out, okay, well, if it was a piano instrumental and he did record it, what was it? And so some people have suggested that it might be a part of the Heroes and Villains later sessions called All Day, but probably not. And other people have suggested it might be the sort of music box ending to wind chimes, but again, probably not. It's also been suggested that wind chimes itself was meant to be the air part of the elements, again, because they were listed as separate tracks on the track listing. Probably not. Best guess, Brian did write an instrumental piece on the piano. It was either never recorded or maybe stuck on some session that's now been lost. We just do not know. But more on that in a minute. Though Vega-Tables has been suggested to be the earth part of the elements. Again, by December it was listed as a separate track on the track listing. There is a connection, as I said before, because Frank Holmes did indicate Vega-Tables was part of the elements on his booklet for SMiLE. And it may be that at that point in the game, since Vega-Tables seemed to be more of a concept than a song for Brian at that point, that may well have been the case, but by December his thinking seemingly had evolved. But there's an interesting little wrinkle to this, and as I was digging into the deep dives and things people have investigated about SMiLE, there is a partial answer to what the elements probably would have been. I did already refer to the fact that there were all these side recordings going on during SMiLE where Brian would tape skits and chants and have people do sound effects. Like Michael Vossi was sent to go out and record water sounds. And there's a decent possibility Brian planned to edit them or incorporate them into his water section of the Elements suite. But there was a session in November where Brian got a bunch of his friends together and had them do a bunch of experimental chants, and there was a good bit of drug consumption involved, I do believe. The entirety of this tape is known collectively as psychedelic sounds, and I don't know if this title comes from then or now. And then there have been bits and pieces of it that have been released. I think some of it was on the SMiLE session, some more interesting parts of it. The whole session, if you want to call it that, is available and people have heard it. I didn't listen to the whole thing. I was most interested in Cassandra Burke's analysis of it, and also the Behind the SMiLE guy. They both discussed this at length, and they link some of the sections of these sort of party-like chanting sessions with Brian and his friends with parts of the elements. And they make a pretty good case that Brian was using this sort of informal party / chanting / drug-taking session with his friends to try out various ideas that he might use for the elements. There was one explicitly connected to water called Underwater Chant. You can hear that one on YouTube. And there was another called Breathing Chant. And these both, again, you can see how these are directly connected to water and air. So the most likely explanation to these bloggers, and I agree with them, is that Brian was considering a lot of different ways he might fulfill these elements concept. And none of them actually fulfilled his ambition. So when he sent Michael Fosse out to do his water effect recording, he was going to listen to it and see if he could make that into his Elements water section. And then when he was doing his underwater chant with his friends, he was trying that idea out also. And it doesn't mean that these informal chanting sessions with his inner circle was going to wind up as part of the Elements suite, but those ideas could later be worked out with the Beach Boys and or the Wrecking Crew guys to form the basis of an actual track, similar to what happened with Fire. And there's some evidence to this because one of the parts of the Psychedelic Sounds tape that was related to his vegetables concept, Brian later fleshed out in the studio with Hal Blaine and recorded in the studio as a proper skit. So there's every reason to think that Brian was testing out these chanting ideas and these concepts for the Element Suite that he later planned to refine and re-record with the band and or actual musicians. So I think that is the most likely answer to what the Elements was going to be. Brian was trying out different ideas. He was listening back to see which ones he thought would work, and he never got to the point of translating them into an actual track, with the possible exception of this air piano instrumental. By the way, there likewise was a water chant recorded by the Beach Boys that very much would have filled the bill for the water section of the Elements, but it was actually recorded later in 1967, long after SMiLE was dead, more towards the Wild Honey session. At any rate, work continued on the SMiLE tracks until almost the end of December 1966, just as Good Vibrations reached #1 worldwide and the Beach Boys topped the Beatles in British magazine The New Musical Express's year-end poll. Brian and the band were at the peak of their artistic respect and attention, and everybody was waiting for and curious about what Brian's next move would be. At this moment, everything seemed possible, and with so much progress made on the album and so much exciting, unique, and groundbreaking music already made, it seemed like Brian was about to fulfill this promise and make the greatest rock and roll album ever made up to that point. Capitol Records confidently pressed up covers and SMiLE booklets adorned by Frank Holmes' illustrations and sent out a promotional message to their sales staff proclaiming, "We're sure to sell 1 million units in January." Brian had already done rough mixes of several of the songs and completed a compilation reel of the work in progress, and as I said, with many of the songs seemingly only lacking lead vocals. Ads were taken out and record store displays made. Unlike with Pet Sounds, with Good Vibrations on top of the charts, Capitol and in Europe, EMI were on board and ready with a massive promotional campaign. However, it was all an illusion. Though the quality and quantity of the music were real and a large amount of work had been done, huge obstacles to the completion of SMiLE lurked in hiding. Though it seemed nearly complete, the gaps to be filled in the lineup turned out to be crevasses, seemingly small, but running very deep. And a series of events in December began to undermine Brian's confidence, break his focus, and start a chain reaction that led to the album beginning to fall apart almost as soon as the calendar flipped over into 1967. Even though sessions for the album dragged on into May, and SMiLE was continually reported as imminent in the music press for the entire first half of 1967, the reality is the SMiLE project as a tangible, achievable reality only really existed until the end of 1966. Beginning in January, Brian would make a series of actions that would make completion of the album increasingly difficult and eventually practically impossible. And in part 2, we will talk about exactly what those actions were, what happened, and why. And with that, we wrap up what I'd hoped was going to be a short video, but I think I've been talking for about 2 hours, and frankly, it's about 2 in the morning here, and I'm starting to be unable to speak. So I'll leave you for now, but I want to thank you for tuning in. And again, I hope you will check out my new song, I Thought It Could Fly. And if you enjoy what we do here on the channel, do check out our Patreon and everything else in the first comment. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.